Are these stories real? Please, you tell us. What I mean is, did any of the following actually happen as described in these scary stories? I saw Dogman battle a horse. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I was visiting my friend who lives way out in the country in Pennsylvania. He has a lovely property surrounded by nature with a river running through his land. If you're quiet, you can hear cows mooing in the distance. It's nothing like where I live in the city. You can drive around and see cows and goats and chickens and horses, although my friend has no animals other than his cat. It was a very relaxing and fun 2 days I spent with him, but almost as soon as I left, I saw something I can't explain, and which severely changed my worldview. I saw a large, fully grown male horse doing battle with a creature straight out of a nightmare. I saw a horse battling some kind of an oversized werewolf or dogman. It was on my way driving out of my friend's area of the world when I passed a huge fenced-off area with grass in it. Nothing but grass, and more grass. I drove and drove for maybe a full minute, seeing nothing but grass to the side of me, when suddenly I could make out what I thought at first was one large, very strange figure, getting closer from a distance. After a while, when I could see better what was going on, I was able to determine that it was, in fact, two creatures involved in some sort of interaction. Intrigued and curious, I slowed my car down and pulled up alongside the action, parking the car and getting out to try to see better. What I saw caused my blood to run cold in the middle of a warm day. There, out in the field, was a large, beautiful brown horse, whinnying and making all sorts of horse noises that a city boy like me had never heard before in his life. At first I thought the horse was dancing, but it was not dancing with this stranger. This horse was in terrible fright and attempting to scare off this large stranger. But what was the other animal? The horse turned and sprinted for a few seconds, putting some distance between the two figures, and then I could see the impossible truth right in front of my eyes. It was so surprising that I literally did that thing they do in the old movies. I rubbed my eyes and then looked again. By the time I did, the second figure had begun sprinting after the horse, and I could see clearly, right there in the midday sun, a man-like, hairy beast chasing the horse. I say man-like, although the head of the creature was completely inhuman, stretched long like a hairy alligator snout, full of crazy long teeth that I could make out clearly even from my distance. The animal's face more closely resembled that of an exotic canine than anything else I could compare it to. It also had ears sticking up on top of its head, like a canine, so I guess possibly I was witnessing an actual Pennsylvania werewolf or dogman. I have to say, though, that it was not a dog or a wolf. It was something different. It had a broad chest like a human being. It had arms with claws like something out of a horror movie. Its back legs were a lot like dog legs, although it ran upright and bipedal on those hind legs. There are no animals that I know of which I could directly compare this creature to. It was definitely something that science is not yet officially aware of. My concern at that moment was not, however, in determining the taxonomy of the monstrous creature attacking the horse. My concern was with the survival of that horse, whose beautiful brown coat shone in the sun. I wanted to help it get away from the dogman somehow, but I'm a city boy, as I've said. I don't carry weaponry on me other than my Swiss Army knife. And then I decided to get back in the car and beep the horn to try to scare the werewolf thing away. Well, I beeped vigorously, but I was too far off for it to make any impact. What else could I do? That dog thing was going to tear the horse to shreds, and I did not want that to happen. My eyes were teared up, and my heart was beating fast and hard. I was either going to witness something heart-wrenchingly sad and horrible happen right in front of my eyes, or I was going to find a way to save that horse's life. Completely out of my mind and behaving in a way I'd never done before and likely never will again, I threw myself back in my car, slammed the door, put the car in reverse, and backed up away from the wooden handmade fence that separated me from the field of grass that all the action was taking place on. I floored the gas pedal and actually screamed and closed my eyes like a child as I rammed the car through the barrier and onto the field. Once off-road, I realized how much harder it was going to be to maneuver my vehicle, and I adjusted quickly, looking around for where the animals were by that point. As I caught sight of them, the horse leaned forward on its two front legs and unleashed a backward kick with its hind legs that would have killed 10 men with one blow. The Dogman reared back and either avoided contact with those hooves entirely, or else they only barely grazed him. In either case, the horse was able to run off, leaving the Dogman momentarily dazed. I knew this was my chance to act, and so I did. Pushing that gas pedal down as far as I could, I got the car going as fast as possible on that lumpy grass surface, and I began beeping my horn like a crazy man. This time, I was close enough that the Dogman heard me and turned in my direction. The closer I got to him, the larger he appeared to be. The horse must have also been larger than I first perceived, because that Dogman was way too tall to be a man in a costume. It had to have been 9 feet tall, as absurd as that sounds. This thing was like a faster, smarter bear. I can't imagine any animal, besides maybe an elephant, that could defeat this thing in a battle. This was the one time in my life that I saw a biological killing machine up close. This creature was born to destroy and eat anything in its path. I remember one brief instant when I looked into the eyes of that Dogman. Those eyes in the bright sunlight were as dark as it's possible to be. They seemed like infinite pools of black water, and I nearly felt hypnotized in that brief instant. However, the beeping and the sight of my car rushing at him over 70 miles an hour caused the Dogman to rethink his strategy, and in the next instant, before his eyes could really do their magic on me, the immense creature turned and ran away. I could make out a fence on the far side and some woods outside of it. I slowed my car down, parked on the grass with the engine idling, and watched until I saw that Dogman hop the fence and disappear beyond it. Breathing a sigh of relief, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to relax again, leaning back in my seat. When I opened my eyes, I realized I was trespassing on someone's property. I had to get back to the highway. If the owner came over here, she would likely not believe my story of a 9-foot-tall werewolf making me drive onto their land. The idea of being caught where I was now seemed almost as frightening as the Dogman had. After all, if there were any damage done to that horse, I would get blamed for it, even though I had saved the horse from the actual attacker. I made it back to the road and drove away, never spotting any humans outside at all. I don't know where that dog should have been, or why it was out of its stable. Maybe the Dogman let him out, I really don't know. And why would the Wolfman Predator be chasing an animal so large? I could see how a pack of dogs might chase larger prey, but a solitary hunter? Why not just catch a rabbit or a bird? What about that horse made that Dogman want to mess with it in the way he was? Could there have been something personal between the two animals? As you can tell, I have no theories to explain what happened that day. I only have questions, really. I was never interested in monsters before, I mean, I always liked monster movies, but I didn't believe that anything from those movies might also exist in the real world. In the years since this incident, however, I have become a lot more interested in the field I now know is called cryptozoology. I'm far from an expert, but I love to listen to anything I can find on the subject because I'm dying to know more. It seems that most people see Dogman at night, and the assumption is that we are talking about a nocturnal creature here. My sighting was in the middle of the day, probably around 1 in the afternoon. Is it possible I saw something other than a Dogman? Is it possible that the werewolf I saw was sick or something? That might explain why it was out in the sunlight and why it was attacking a creature as large as that horse. Maybe the Dogman was out of his mind with a fever or something along those lines. Rabies or mange or whatever the werewolf versions of those might be. Maybe it didn't know what it was doing the day that I saw Dogman. Battle a Horse. Don't go anywhere. We've got another 2 hours of Dogman stories coming right up, but first I need to thank today's executive producer, the Friendly Futurist. He's the Friendly Futurist. Nothing rhymes with futurist, but he's the Friendly Futurist, and we like him fine. A little verse lieb there in honor of today's executive producer who gets to see all our weekly Sunday night uncensored scary stories far too wild to tell on this channel. He also gets access to our archive of 15 hours of scary, secret, uncensored stories available nowhere else. You can too by joining at the $3 level or above at our PayPal club at peterbernard.com, or by doing what the Friendly Futurist did and clicking the join link below this or any of our videos. And now, without further ado, let's launch into our collection of the best Dogman stories of 2020 so far. And let's begin the celebration with this next story that we call...
It's me, Willy, and I've got a brand new double-length Dogman story for you today that your old pal Bigfoot was too scared to tell. It's a story told by the great-great-great-great-grandson of multiple generations of outdoors folk. He not only has stories to tell about the Dogman which stretch back decades, he's gonna tell us about the evolving descriptions of the monster over the years. Before we get to that though, we have to pause to say thanks to this episode's executive producer, Pardis, without whom this show would not be possible. For Pardis, I have written this this rhyme. He's no longer named Itris, which sort of rhymes with citrus. Executive producer Pardis, we hope he'll never part us. Pardis was an original member of our paid subscribers club over at peterbernard.com, who recently switched to our channel memberships here on YouTube. If you'd like to do the same, just click the join link under this or any of our videos, and then you, like Pardis, will get to see our secret uncensored Dogman stories we put out each Sunday night. Stories far too wild and crazy to ever tell on this channel. PQ Ripper will be here at the very end of this episode with more details, but now let's get to our double-length story of the day, which we call...
The Muddy Pond Monster. Dear Scary Stories NYC. My family has lived with Dogman for decades. They started encountering them long before my birth. We are what you would call an outdoorsy clan, and we tend to be under the stars as much as we're under a rooftop. That gives us a percentage better chance to encounter critters that aren't supposed to be there, but are anyway. The The other thing is that we've lived off the land for longer than can be remembered, and we have the blood of native trackers running through our veins, although we are of a greatly mixed ancestry. I laughed when I read of scientists testing the dirt to find out what animal species live in a particular area. We use much more ancient, obvious, and simpler means to accomplish a very similar thing. I'm happy for science to finally catch up to us, but really, all they had to do was ask. My family and I have hiked most of Tennessee and Kentucky, and we've hunted wherever it was legal. This goes back past the 1800s, which was when one of my ancestors married a European woman, and we became part of two cultures at once. He became Christian, and in turn she learned the ways of his people. Since then, we've shared our genealogy with every kind of human being that there is, and in the process we've developed our own family culture that seems to be quite unique as far as I can tell. We no longer really belong to any tribe other than our own. Being outsiders allows us to observe the world and grasp relationships between different aspects of nature better. You can understand drama if you aren't emotionally caught up in it. It's like living life in a hunting blind. You watch the world, but the world usually has no idea that you're even there. And so we've prided ourselves on understanding the reality around us. There are things accepted as real by us that no other people have even heard of. One of the species in our area accepted as real by us, yet unknown to most, is a creature, rarely seen though he may be, that stands like a man, yet barks like a dog. It looks like both, but is not either. It's been seen scavenging, and it's been interrupted by us while it was hunting. It's been known to stalk and chase men, and it may possibly even be a man-eater. My ancestors and family have never actually been taken down by any of these dogmen, but we are outdoors people, as I've already indicated. Do the dogmen sometimes attack or even consume human beings? It's not a question that we have an answer to, but we generally assume it's best to prepare for the worst possible outcome when dealing with any kind of predator, or really any obstacle or problem at all when in the wild. If it's bigger than you, has claws and sharp teeth, just assume that you're on its menu and put your attention to the task of getting away from the incident uninjured. The particular kind of creature I'm referring to was dubbed by my family the Muddy Pond Monster. There was also a Sasquatch in the area in the late 60s and early 70s that would sometimes be referred to by the same name, but usually when I'd hear about the Muddy Pond Monster when I was a kid, it was of the Dogman variety. Well, technically, earlier on they said it had the head of a horse with a wide grinning mouth, but what else could that mean except a dog head? The stories I was told as a child were that the Muddy Pond Monster was like the Jersey Devil without the bat wings. It was sort of a horse that stood up on its hind legs, and instead of hooves in the front, it had sharp claws with which it would snatch bad children away in the night and eat them for breakfast. As I grew older, my father told me that the monster was not just a fairy tale, as his father had seen it and shot at it. Not long after, both my father and I saw it while together out in the forest, and what we saw looked more like an upright standing dog than a horse. Yet I'm pretty certain this is the same monster as the one my ancestors described dealing with. The claws were the same, and the sense that you were in the presence of something out of the ordinary was the same as had been described to me since I was very young. The name Muddy Pond that we attached to the monster isn't just random. He wasn't called that because he lived underwater or was muddy. Muddy Pond is the name of a tiny place in Tennessee not far from Kentucky, That having been said, I never heard a story about this Dogman being seen in that town. I know I'm sounding illogical, but I'll explain. To be honest, we never saw the monster in Muddy Pond. We didn't know anyone from Muddy Pond, and I don't know if anyone who lived there ever saw the monster. It's just that the town seemed to be located in the center of the area in which we would find evidence of the creature and where we had our encounters. Mostly, the MPM Dogman seemed to move between the area north of Muddy Pond, in the area toward Wilder, to the land east of the town, heading toward Alpine Acres and the Catoosa Wildlife Management Area. So I suppose we could have called it the Catoosa Critter or the Alpine Acres Animal or the Wilder Werewolf just as easily as the Muddy Pond Monster. The decision was made before I was born though, so this story today is about the Muddy Pond Monster, which is what we, our family, call the subspecies of North American upright walking canids that plagued us for generations. My father told me a story about his grandfather encountering one of the creatures back during the Great Depression of the early 20th century. He said that the monster stood 15 feet tall, like a horse, reared back on his hind legs, with a wide devil grin on its demonic face. Instead of whinnying like an earthly horse would, this devil horse let out a sound as though he had a sore throat. It was a coughing sort of a sound, more akin to the barking of a dog than any sound a horse was meant by God to make. Even as a kid, hearing this, I thought they had run into a Dogman. They even said that it sounded as though it were barking. So the question is, if they did see a Dogman, why did they describe it as having the head of a horse and not that of a dog? What exactly was meant by the horse having a wide grin? My father just took it literally like a creepy, smiling horse, but I was envisioning the long snout of a dog or a wolf. Being outdoorsmen like my generation is, my ancestors back then certainly knew what canines were, and no doubt had pet dogs and probably hunting dogs as well. There is no way they would have mistaken a dog for a horse, even if it were standing up on its hind legs. And yet, even still, I can't imagine that there ever really was a bipedal feral horse loose in the United States. I still feel that it had to have been a Dogman or a werewolf. I mean, that's what my father saw, that's what I saw, some of my extended family alive right now as well. Of course, some of my relatives endured a Bigfoot flap back around 50 years ago that I mentioned before, but for the most part, the monster that we've seen around here within my lifetime has been the Dogman. There's another possibility that goes through my mind from time to time. What if the Dogman looked more like a horse back then than it does now? What if it's evolved that much in just a generation or two or three? After all, the ones we've seen are not 15 feet tall as they reported the horse-like monsters being. One logical argument against this theory is that people were reporting Dogman-like creatures way back in the early 20th century too. I have this other question though. What if these aren't natural creatures? I mean, either the horse-like ones, or the modern ones, or both. What if they are shamans, or sorcerers, or brujos? What if they're shapeshifters? In that case, wouldn't they be able to choose to have any kind of head they might like to have? Even a horse with a wide grin? Maybe. Maybe not. I certainly can't answer that question. Maybe the answer is as simple as the changing whims of local skinwalkers, or even one or two genetically deformed dogmen. For whatever the reason is, my father and my generation have witnessed tall dogs, sometimes seeming to be over 10 feet tall, but not always. They walk bipedally. They are usually colored dark, but with stripes and swirls in their coats occasionally. The heads are very wolf-like, and the eyes appear black in the day and a glowing orange-yellow at night. Unlike other canines, you will not see this species panting. They have an air of intelligence about them, although it's hard to tell if that's real or imaginary, since our interactions with them have rarely been complex or long enough to judge the intelligence of the monsters. I used to date a woman who objected to my use of the term monster to describe the dogmen around here. She said that it was disrespectful, that I was demonizing one of nature's creatures, and that I should treat them with the respect I would treat any other living thing. I tried to explain to her, I treat monsters with a lot more respect than I treat regular animals. It's because monsters are a lot scarier than regular animals. A bear can sneak up on you and do you in horribly any time it wants to, but I don't call a bear a monster. This thing, this dogman, this is a monster, to be feared far more than even a man-eating bear. Any person in my family would tell you the same thing because for generations we've dealt with both animals and monsters. Now I'll tell you about that first time that my father and I saw the Muddy Pond monster. We had been following a big old 8-point buck, trying to get a good angle on him when suddenly, somehow, we lost him. It was one of those rare, inexplicable moments out in nature where an animal is there, and then it seems to go behind some cover and just never appears again on either side. You surround the location so that between you, you're seeing the entire area. There is nowhere for the buck to go that you won't be able to see him clearly, but somehow, he just isn't there anymore. Anyone who hunts long enough eventually has one of these kinds of stories to tell, although I don't think most people will admit what I'm saying. This was one of those hunter stories you don't brag about later at the bar. This was one of those that unnerves you so much that you don't really want to think about it too often. It kind of feels like a nightmare come to life. Well, I didn't even get to the worst part of this story yet. After about an hour of waiting, we were hearing nothing at all coming from those bushes. We came around and were talking to each other, trying to discuss how to flush him out, assuming he was hunkered down hiding in the foliage somewhere. If we went in after him, he might be waiting for us, so it seemed a lot safer for us to get him to come on out. A large male deer with that huge a rack can do extreme damage to a human being that he feels threatened by. He can even stomp you out like a cigarette butt, so you don't really want to give him a chance to get the upper hand. While we were whispering back and forth, the leaves over in that direction started to sort of jiggle. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, and neither was he. We began to wonder if the buck was injured, and we slowly, quietly, made our way toward the spot. The leaves that were moving were pretty far down low to the ground, so for the most part my eyes were there, although I kept looking around to try to get the unfolding event into perspective. I wasn't really understanding at all what I was seeing, and I don't think my father was either. And then, this scene from 1001 Arabian Nights unfolded, and up out of the bushes rose this incredibly tall, blue genie. Except it wasn't a genie, it was a demonic-looking dog-headed grayish-blue monster, and it had been waiting for us to come close enough for it to stand up and say hello. The hair on top of the dogman was thicker and denser, and again, over its privates and on top of its legs. The fur was lighter, bluer, and far more closely cropped over the rest of it. It gave a sort of an impression of a dark mane, but it also reminded me of a bear with mange. The ears were pointed, and the chest was not actually bald, though, so this animal did not have mange. It just had longer hair in some places, and shorter, lighter-colored hair in others. Like how a horse has very short hair on its body, but longer hair on its mane, sort of. The eyes of the dogman do actually glow in the dark, and I witnessed that in the first instant of my first sighting. I was so surprised that I fell over backward. You know when people say that I was so surprised you could have knocked me over with a feather? Well, this was that, come to life, and I literally fell over backward. My father wasn't so lucky as to be such a complete klutz as I am, and the Dogman reached out and grabbed him by his shirt with one huge hand-like claw. The hand was almost as big as Dad's midsection itself, and that long arm lifted this grown man right up off the ground. Dad dropped his defense in surprise and began making this noise that an animal makes when it knows it's about to meet oblivion. Still lying on the ground, I fired off a shot into the air, which fortunately surprised the monster, causing him to momentarily release his grip on my father. We ran. Dad grabbed his defensive stick and we both got out of there. We did not hear the muddy pond monster following us, but we assumed he would stalk us back to wherever we went next. We debated tactics quickly, eventually deciding to try to lead the creature away from the direction of our home. To do this, we ran in the wrong direction for a couple of 100 feet over muddy ground, making sure to leave tracks on easy-to-read terrain. Then, we climbed this large tree and got ourselves up a way. We were able to jump over onto a branch of the next tree over and the next. We got as far in the direction of home as we could up in the air, then jumped down and made a run for it the rest of the way. It was our hope that the Dogman wouldn't pick up our second trail. I do think it worked, as we never did see them on our own turf. We would only witness them when we ventured out into their range. Most of the Dogmen we've seen were darkly colored, like I mentioned earlier. One time, I saw one that seemed black all over. I didn't get too much detail that happened at night and from a distance. I'm curious if the all-dark one has longer hair all over, or if the mane covers the entire body, or if it's just that the short body hair is darker on that one. It might be that the fully dark one was a female or a younger one, as it seemed to be about the size of a man, not giant like they usually appear. Other than that incident, the Dogmen that we see seem to be male. I wonder where the females and the young live. Maybe the adult males go out to hunt and scavenge not just for themselves, but for their families as well, and that might explain why we only or usually seem to see the males. It might also be possible that the females and families live in tribes, but that the males roam between tribes, more like rogue males than alphas. That could also explain why we don't see the females or the young, and why it's always the large adult males. Obviously, unless or until someone can figure out how to get close enough to this species to observe their behavior, we won't know the answers to these questions. I do have a number of other personal encounters with this creature or forest god or whatever it might be, but you probably get the point by now. I think I've covered the main points. I do want to say that the Dogman is the scariest thing in the woods that I know of. It's probably scarier than a Sasquatch, although I've never seen one of those. It's definitely scarier than a wildcat or a bear or any kind of snake. Seeing a Dogman is probably something like seeing, a tiger. It means you're in deep poo-poo. Although I personally have only ever seen one Dogman at a time, I've heard sounds around me during some of the encounters that make me think that they might hunt in packs, and that they might know more about what's happening than you do. It pays to learn the ways they mark their turf so you can get out of situations quickly that they might be trying to lure you into. It would be far wiser to never underestimate the intelligence and cunning of the Muddy Pond Monster. Dogman chased my bicycle. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Bicycling is good for you. It's good exercise. It's an effective means of transportation. It can often be fun, and if you own your own bike, then it saves you money. In spite of all that, I've decided to take a little break from biking for a while, and I'll run on my treadmill in my basement instead. Nothing against biking. It's just that I got a bit shaken up when Dogman chased my bicycle. I don't want to tell you my name because I don't need that kind of celebrity, but I will admit where this took place. Downers Grove, Illinois. Specifically, I was biking near the Hidden Lakes Forest Preserve. It's a beautiful place and I don't want to scare anyone off from using it, especially right now when we all need fresh air and sunshine. I was riding just before dawn in order to get my exercise in, and I think that was where I made my mistake. After all, it's a forest preserve over there. Animals are going to be around, and if you want to ride your bike around a forest preserve in the dark, you'd better bring some friends or take precautions. I did neither, acting as though I were riding around in my own backyard. The Dogman was there, however, to correct my misperceptions. I don't know when he first began chasing me. I only noticed when he already was behind me. It was the single greatest surprise of my life. I can't even compare it to anything else. It was unmistakably a Dogman. It had the head of a dog. It had the hind legs of a dog. And yet, it was standing up, looking down at me with unreadable, glowing white eyes. He was twice as big as I was, and he kept reaching forward as though he were attempting to tear at the spokes on my back wheel. He was so much larger than I was. I'm certain that he could have caught up to me any time, and yet he seemed to always miss. He ran on his hind legs in a somewhat clumsy manner, bent over at the waist and reaching out toward my hind wheel. I rode faster and faster, and he always seemed to remain just exactly the same distance behind me, just barely out of reach. He never fell back, and he never advanced on me. And then, as I drove past two policemen who I suppose were on patrol, I stopped to point out the giant behemoth to them. To my utter surprise, there was nothing there. Not wanting to seem like a nut job, I just thanked the officers for their service to the city, and I rode away, still out of breath from being chased. Instead of going home, I stopped at a diner I knew and I ordered a breakfast. Even long after the sun was up and the sky was bright, I felt frightened about cycling the rest of the way home, so I ordered a second breakfast. Like I said, I dusted off my treadmill in the basement after that incident, and I've been exercising at home, where there are no big, hairy, weird monsters trying to grab at my back wheel. What the hell was that all about anyway? Like, why the back wheel? Is that a dog thing? Or was he just trying to make me crash? I hope I never find out the answers to those questions. It's been a messed up time for me ever since. Dogman chased my bicycle. Our executive producer is Daniel Bivian. He's a guy who really understands good living. He knows how to save $1 and a pence because he just joined our club for only 99 cents. That's right. You can now click the join button under this or any of our videos and join our channel memberships for only 99 cents. This allows you to see the new secret uncensored Sunday stories each week. You can also join for $3 and up to unlock other perks like access to our 10 hours of secret uncensored scary stories far too wild to tell on this channel. For $10 a month, you can watch our videos before the general public. There are various options and you can find out more by clicking that join link under any of our videos. We're also grateful if you click like or share or subscribe, as we need all the help we can to keep the show going. And speaking about keeping the show going, it's time for our next story, which is called I Saw Dogman. when I took cold medication. Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a kid, my mother would buy the kind of cold medicine that you only had to take once every 12 hours. No, not that brand you're thinking of. She would buy the store brand knockoff version, which was cheaper. I mean, I guess I would too now that I'm an adult, but I still have an aversion and a deep fear of taking that kind of cold medicine. Why? Because I saw Dogman the last time I took 12-hour cold medication. I don't remember how old I was, but I remember I had never felt so bad before. I've felt worse since, believe me, but this was the first great illness of my childhood. I had never had chicken pox, I had never gotten the flu, and when I had a cold, it was always gone by the next morning. Then, suddenly, I had this uncontrollable sneezing and a fever. It wasn't a big deal, but I didn't know that. It scared me because it was new to me and it felt really bad. So my mother gave me that store brand cold medicine, the first time I had been given the adult kind of cold medicine ever, I'm proud to say. And within minutes, I was passed out asleep in my bed. It was quite merciful as I had been unable to sleep with my head cold. I don't know what time in the middle of the night I awoke, but I wasn't sure I was really awake when I was. I used to sleep next to a window out onto the backyard, only this time, there was a man standing in the way of my view. At first I thought he was a caveman like Fred Flintstone wearing an animal pelt, but his face didn't look like a caveman. His face looked more like a hairy demon of some kind. It was hideously ugly looking, but I couldn't accept that it was real, and I felt as though this must be one of those dreams you have as you're waking up. I tried to move my body and I wasn't sure it was working, so that must have meant I was still asleep, I thought. I waited for the monster to go away, or for me to be able to move my body, and I was very surprised when I suddenly found myself sitting up in bed, bringing my face even closer to this demonic type entity just on the other side of the glass from me. I looked more closely at him and saw that he was an extraordinarily hairy guy. I mean, in some places his hair looked like matted fur. In other places, it was curly and tangled. He appeared as though he lived outdoors and never brushed his hair or bathed. He was filthy, and in spots where the fur was sparser, his skin seemed nasty and blemished. It was somewhere around that point when I started to feel fear. I know that by the time I looked back at his face, my heart was beating fast. This was not even a caveman. This was some kind of an animal that stood up somehow on its hind legs. It had tall ears on top and eyes, kind of like a cat, but a long snout that put it more in the category of a canine than a feline. It had teeth, like you would expect in a dinosaur. This thing looked like he could take a Sasquatch in a fight, and I was just sitting there and watching him like he was an afternoon soap opera, wondering what was going to happen next. Realizing the danger I was in, I decided to try to act as casual as I could, and I began to slowly, boringly, climb back away from the dog-headed, filthy beast man. As I reached to put my foot on the floor, I misjudged a bit and slipped off the bed with a sudden movement. This set the dogman off, barking loudly and pushing his face into the window so hard, I thought the glass was going to break. I screamed and ran out of the room to my parents' bedroom. They were pretty angry at me before I even got there. I screamed that there was a creepy man in a monster costume outside my window because, even at that age, I knew they wouldn't believe the actual truth. I mean, it took me over a minute of staring at that thing before even I believed the truth. I made my plea for someone to come back and see the creepy guy. My father refused to come to my room and see what was outside my window, but my mother did come. Think how different those days were to today in terms of the parental reaction. That Dogman, or whatever it was, had steamed up the window when it pressed its face to the glass, and the steam was still dissipating as we walked into the room. I knew my mother saw it because she walked faster the last few steps in order to see it up close while she still could. There were also other marks left on the glass, the kinds dogs leave when they press their noses up against windows. It was a dog, she told me, or maybe a wolf. It wasn't a man in a costume. She asked me again for a description and then just sat there looking confused. Finally, she called her sister and woke her up, and her sister woke up her husband, who used to work at a zoo a long time ago. He said it sounded like I saw a bear with mange, and so, to my mother, that was what I saw. My father was forced to put up tall fencing around our property because my mother didn't want sick bears breaking in to kidnap her poor sick son. Dad did it, but he resented me for it for years. I remember we were all having a fun cookout one summer afternoon when I was a teenager, and randomly, my father started pointing to that fence and telling me how much it cost him to build. He asked me when I was going to pay him back for that fence, since it was my imaginary bear that caused him to have to spend the money. Meanwhile, I never even said it was a bear. I said it was a guy in a monster costume. But inside, I knew what really happened. It was something life-changing, yet something I never admitted to anyone in the world before writing this to you. The real truth of the matter was, and I admit it today, I saw Dogman when I took cold medication. I nearly ran down a Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I had a Dogman encounter just the other day, and it was also a powerful deja vu kind of synchronicity for me personally at the same time. This scared me so badly that my mind got completely blown, so please feel free to correct my grammar and make me sound like a science professor in your version. Then, when I play it for girls, I can tell them I really talk like that and impress them. I don't know if I should tell you about the synchronicity first, or the Dogman. I guess I would want to hear about the monster first, so let me tell you what happened. Then stick around for why this was doubly weird for me personally. I was coming out of Atoka up in the middle of the Chickasaw and Choctaw nations, heading south to Dallas. I work part-time driving people, so you could sort of say I'm a modern-day cab driver. That night, I had driven someone home and was returning to Dallas on Route 75. In my opinion, that's the most direct route between the two places. Plus, there was zero traffic that night, and I find zero traffic relaxing. At least I did up until that night. Route 75 is pretty in the day in the part north of Sherman that I was driving on. It's just highways on the flat ground with grass between them. No streetlights, nothing fancy, just you and nature and the big blue sky. Except when it's nighttime and it's raining and you're kind of hydroplaning a little bit, you don't want to drive too fast. Plus, the only light is coming from your headlights, and you have to squint out onto the road to see things between the rain and your windshield wipers. I was thinking about getting over to Route 91, which I think has lights on it. Don't quote me on that. I should have double-checked before writing you this. Please fix that part so I can impress the ladies even further. Okay, all joking aside, this is the part of the story that I have a hard time joking around about. I am extremely grateful that neither I nor our guest star in the story got hurt in any way by this incident, but it came so close to being a very bad scene that I'm going to need a little more time to get completely over it. I have had a nightmare where I woke up thinking that I hurt him, and another time I dreamed that he leaped on the back of my truck and tried to climb inside the driver's seat window. Clearly, I'm still working it all out internally. But here's what happened in real life to the best of my ability to recall. Bam! The Dogman was there, walking out in front of me. I'll describe him in a minute. I slammed on the brakes and I gripped the wheel, not knowing if I should turn it left or right. Was that thing going to take another step forward? Or maybe a step back? Or might it stand where it was? I stared through the downpour at the creature, trying to read anything at all from its face or body posture. Then, just as I was about to turn hard to the right, a random decision since I had to do something, the creature took a step back, and I instead swerved the pickup and myself to the left. We went right off the road and onto the wet grass, but somehow I didn't lose my traction. With no traffic around, I just drove, turning casually until I was back on the highway and eventually back in my correct lane. I saw the upright walking dog, who I still need to describe for you, heading off in the same direction he had been heading in all along and out of my view. I started cursing and swearing furiously. I was not sure who the hell I was screaming at, but I knew I was angry about it. It was like I was complaining that life was being unfair, doing things like that to me. But really, nothing had actually happened. Something had almost happened, something had been avoided, but nothing really happened. I have nothing to complain about. I have a lot to be thankful for. Now, as for what the Dogman looked like, he stood very tall, like a tall man. Not 8 feet tall, but well over 6 feet. He had long hair, which hung straight down as he was drenched in the rain. I could see that his hair was thicker and longer around the neck and shoulders, giving it the appearance of a kind of a lion's mane. The fur was thicker and thinner in other places too, but I only remember specifically that it got bushier on the lower legs. I was looking toward the head and shoulders to try to gauge what its next move was going to be. Then I was looking down at its dog-like feet to see if it was going to move forward or back. To be clear, this was a 2-legged creature, although it also appeared canine. Throughout the incident, and again when I saw it running off in the end, the creature always stood on its hind legs. Now, as for its arms, I apologize that I completely vegged on observing them. I've read up on the different types of Dogman since this happened, and really I can visualize the creature I saw with any of the different kinds of arms that people say they sometimes have. I saw a dog-like head, human, muscular shoulders covered in a lion's mane of dark, wet, dripping fur, and I saw it stand on large canine legs and feet. The incident happened without warning, and was fortunately over so quickly that I had not yet progressed to the point of concerning myself with its paws or claws or hands. I just didn't want to hit the thing, and I didn't. I was lucky. Now, as to why this was a synchronicity for me, that's kind of weird and a little hard to explain. I had just watched a documentary online about a musician named Call Me Steve Baters. If you look up how he passed on, you'll see it involved a cab, and it happened in Paris. So I drove on past the incident, really shaken up, and around a couple of minutes later, just before I was about to pass through Sherman, I saw a sign for Route 82 heading east for, you guessed it, Paris. No, not Paris, France. Paris, Texas. So I didn't have my incident in Paris, but it was nearby. And it didn't involve a world-famous musician, but it did involve the only cryptid I've ever gotten to see with these eyes. Do I derive any meaning from this apparent synchronicity? No. I'm just a lot more confused about life in general now than I used to be. If there's a lesson in any of this, maybe it's that whenever you think life has gotten as crazy as it can get, brace yourself, because things are about to get kicked up a notch. It's a lesson to learn from 2020 in general. But for me, most especially, the other night when I nearly ran down a Dogman.
Welcome to Scary Stories. I am Willy. Bigfoot is too scared to be here today because it is Friday the 13th. I am not scared of anything though. That is why I am better than Bigfoot. I have two stories today, both about Friday the 13th. Are they true or not? Nobody told me. You decide, and I guess then we'll know. All I can say is they're both pretty creepy. And this first one is called
The Friday the 13th Dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I come from a good family in a big city. Our culture is very status-based, money-oriented, competitive, jealous, but also science and statistic-driven. I grew up around people who only care about hard, cold reality. I was just like that myself, and I was living a happy life, heading toward an even happier one. And then I saw Dogman on Friday the 13th, and my luck changed to bad, for good. Some of you might correctly point out that seeing the Dogman and surviving to tell the tale is not exactly bad luck. That's good luck. I can see that point, and I have to admit that in some ways I do feel grateful and blessed. I had a rare experience, and I was not hurt in the process. On the other hand, that Dogman experience changed me. Once I was changed, none of my friends really wanted to know me any longer. My parents and siblings grew embarrassed of me, and my life sort of rebooted. Again, you can say that was good luck, but if so, it was painful in either case. I had been a skeptic. I didn't believe in anything but science, or so I thought. I felt there was a materialistic answer to any question back then. I also felt superior to those who believed in monsters and UFOs. How childish, I thought. And my friends, well, they all felt the same way. Why, we were sophisticated city-dwelling members of the cultural elite. If we said it didn't exist, then that meant anyone who saw a Bigfoot or a Dogman must be some country bumpkin fool. Suddenly, I had my own traumatic encounter with a canine-headed bipedal creature. And not only did I suddenly believe passionately in the existence of at least one kind of cryptid, but I could no longer accept the materialistic worldview that my friends held. To be honest, materialism as a concept is antique. It isn't even scientific in the modern sense of the word, as we now know for a fact that matter itself does not really exist. It's just energy that isn't moving as fast, so it appears to us to be solid and material. The universe is energy and vibration. It's sound and light, but probably ultimately sound. Don't you think? No? Well, my friends didn't think so either. Suddenly, I was an idiot, and crazy on top of that. I went from being treated as a peer by some of the most successful people in the city to being regarded as more feeble-minded than their servants. And yes, these people think everyone is a pawn in their game. They see 99% of the world as entirely inconsequential, and they laugh about it amongst themselves. They used to include me in their tittering, and I used to laugh along. Now they see me as a loose cannon, a danger to myself and others. They work to discredit everything I say, even stuff that's clearly true. Well, especially stuff that's clearly true. When you're told that someone is dangerous by the powers that be, that only means that person is dangerous to the powers that be. I used to join in the dogpiling onto whoever was being canceled that week, but then I got canceled too. I learned a lot of lessons because of this Friday the 13th Dogman experience, and as I describe it, some certain people might find the story familiar and then be able to figure out who I am. However, the only people who know my story are very, very rich, and I don't know how much time they spend on YouTube. So now let me finally get to the story itself. It was, as already stated, Friday the 13th. This was some years back. I was driving to meet two comrades of mine who wanted to introduce me to somebody for some business connection. I don't really remember. They told me to just come over to their country estate, and I wasn't busy that day, so I did. I had no fear of Friday the 13th, of course, and I was in the mood for a long drive out to the country. When I say long, I mean it. Something like 7 hours. They were out in this rich suburb of Pittsburgh called Jefferson Hills or something like that. But my experience didn't take place at their estate. It took place on the way there. The way I've told this story for years, I was on Route 711 when I saw the Dogman. I thought that was funny, since 711 is supposed to be good luck, and this was a story about Friday the 13th and bad luck. I'm looking at Google Maps, though, and that seems unlikely. Route 711 isn't as forested over there. I now think I must have been driving on Route 31, probably somewhere around Somerset, Pennsylvania. It looks more like how I remember. There was a forest on one side of the road and a guardrail on the other side to prevent cars from going off a little cliff down to where I think there was a stream or a river or something. So, on one side, the forest graded up slightly, and on the other, the land dropped away suddenly. I had been driving probably around 6 hours, so I was getting tired and cranky, and the sky was growing darker. I don't remember what time it was, but it was dusk when it's getting harder to see. I remember thinking about taking the toll road for the rest of the trip, just because it should, in theory, have lights on it. The route I was on was growing creepier and creepier, and I was beginning to feel very alone, and very exposed, and very uncomfortable. I had taken that route to save money and to avoid traffic, but at that moment, I would have loved to have seen any other cars out there at all. And then, the beast walked down off the mountain, through the woods, and onto the 2-lane highway I was driving on. It was the most incredible thing I had ever seen. Even if nothing else had happened that night, just seeing this creature would have forever altered the direction of my life. It was what people now call a dogman. It was a canine-type creature with brown and tan-colored fur, but it stood up on its hind legs as it walked, and it had to be over 7 feet tall when fully upright. The face was not exactly like a dog or a wolf. It had taller teeth than I'd ever seen in a modern animal. I never saw it close its mouth around those teeth. That's how large they were. And its eyes glowed in an unnatural way, like something from a science fiction movie. It looked either like an enchanted beast from a Lord of the Rings sequel, or maybe something dropped off here from another galaxy. In other words, it wasn't just another bear sighting. I was stunned, and I was impressed, and I felt ashamed of all the times I had said rude things about people who see monsters. All that time, I had been cruel to people who had no say in the fact that they had come face to face with something inexplicable. I felt ashamed for what a jerk I'd been, and at the same time, I knew I would either have to lie and say I never saw this, or I was going to lose my status and my friends. I saw it all in that blink of a moment, but what I did not see was that the Dogman had already grown severely unhappy with the fact that I was present at that moment. He slammed his hands or paws or whatever they were down on the hood of my car, and I screamed and felt like I needed to use the little boy's room. I never felt that scared before. I saw my life flashing in front of my eyes, and I mean every scene from my entire life. I felt all the happy times, but mostly I felt the regrets. I made note of the things that I never got to do. I understood that I would never see anyone I loved ever again, and that this was going to hurt them as much as it hurt me. Emotionally, I prepared to move on to whatever is next after this existence. And then, after doing all that, I slammed the car into reverse and put my foot through the floor on the gas pedal. The Dogman fell backward onto the road as I kept driving in reverse, trying to get some distance between me and him. He got up and began running toward me. I slammed on the brakes, put the car in drive, and tried to see how fast I could get it going before my bumper reached the same point in space and time as that Dogman. It turned out that I got it up over 65 miles per hour. But you don't have to worry, those of you rooting for the Dogman. He did not end up pizza meat on Route 31 in Pennsylvania. The Dogman was too agile for that. He just ran over my car as I drove underneath him. I'm not even joking. That's how fast this creature's reactions were, and how quickly it was able to run and to make adjustments mid-run on 2 legs. That's far beyond the ability of any living creature known by science. Nothing else could do that. So this creature proved to me that I needed to get a whole lot more humble, and I needed to learn that I didn't know all there was to know about everything. I saw the Dogman regrouping, and I knew he would continue his pursuit of me, so I risked getting pulled over, and I kept going 65 or more until I saw the signs for Route 76, the toll road, and I got off that godforsaken highway. I was pretty shaken up that night, as the estate was located in the midst of a dark woods, and that was about the last place I wanted to be that night. I ended up not doing business with those 2 guys because they wouldn't cut me any slack for having had such a hard trip out there. It was the first time in my life I thought guys were acting too macho. I used to be the one that got labeled in that way, but I guess the Dogman showed me that I'm not on top of the food chain. Ever since that night, I kind of don't like people who brag or act like big shots. If you think you're so big and bad, I say prove it. Go up face to face against the creature that I saw. I'd like to see you step into the ring with the Friday the 13th Dogman.
Today's executive producer is Michael A. Bell. He helped make the show possible, ain't that swell? He's cooler than a dude on a motorcycle. I'm just talking about my man Michael. Please join us in thanking Michael A. Bell for helping make this show possible. In return, he gets to see our secret Sunday Uncensored Scary Stories. Find out how you can too, either by joining our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com or by clicking the join link under this or any of our videos. We'll have more info at the end of this episode, but first, let's tell our other scary Friday the 13th story of the day, and we call this one
I Saw Dogman on Friday the 13th. Dear Scary Stories NYC, what's the deal with Friday the 13th? All it means is that you're in a month that started on a Sunday, that's all. And yet, even if you try not to believe in it, Friday the 13th turns out to be Friday the 13th, often enough that we still, most of us, have a big problem with that day. For me, I got away scot-free for the longest time, watching my friends have bad luck happen to them on the dreaded date, but avoiding it myself. And then, finally, it happened to me, too. I saw the Dogman on Friday the 13th, and then I had 3 years of horrible luck after that. Here's the story exactly how I remember it happening to me personally. Some say that the Mothman in West Virginia was a harbinger of doom, foretelling the collapse of the Silver Bridge back in the late 1960s. Well, then Dogman must be my personal harbinger, because my life took a weird turn into Nowheresville, USA, after my worst Friday the 13th so far. I had thought that my luck was finally taking a turn for the better when I got offered twice my normal pay to deliver a bunch of boxes to some location the next state over. I can't say where this story took place. You'll understand why in a few minutes. It was a Friday the 13th back X number of years ago when I was still young, happy, and naive. I jumped in their van, which they had already loaded in the back for me, and I took off for the spot they had indicated on the map. It was a paper map they gave me, although their van did have a primitive GPS in it even back then. This place was over a bridge, then a long drive into the country, like a 2.5 hour long drive. It was nothing but forest and forest as far as you could see. I felt like I was in ancient times or an amusement park ride, like VR, you know? As though I were coming from the future and driving down a narrow 2-lane highway through the ancient primeval earth. A Ray Bradbury kind of thing. As long as I drove on the road, I was safe. But, you know, if I ran over a butterfly, then the future would get even worse than it is already, or something like that. Sometimes on bright days or very clear nights, I can get that same feeling when I drive over very large bridges. It feels incredible, like something you would wait online to experience, even though you're only there because you're trying to get from one place to another. I was once on the subway in New York City when the train broke down and we had a crazy person locked in the car with us. My friend I was with was panicked, but I was like, this is better than the best haunted house ride ever, and twice as scary. I guess it's my automatic defense so that I don't panic in times of stress. Or maybe, to be completely honest, I must have known deep down that I wasn't going to get hurt any of those times. The reason I'm saying that is because when I had my confrontation with the Dogman, I did not feel like I was on an amusement park ride. I felt like I might be about to be in a whole lot of physical pain. And even if any contact were avoided, the experience had already been emotionally scarring. I'm starting from the middle. I should begin at the start of it. I was in a claustrophobic, twisty part of the little highway with densely packed trees on both sides of me. Then, way off in the distance, at the far edge of a rightward turn in the road, a large figure appeared to be running, kind of like a jogging NFL football player. I took my foot off the gas to slow down a bit in case I had to maneuver around the runner, and literally before I could understand what was happening, the huge silhouette raced toward me, faster than would be humanly possible. It was in the light of my headlights for less than a second, but I saw the dog head over an almost chimp-like body. Maybe I say chimp because it was colored more like a chimp than any dog I'd ever seen. Also, its front paws splayed out on my windshield in front of me for a few seconds, and they nearly looked like hands to me. Imagine a monkey's paw with the fingers half the length of a normal monkey, ending in claws, like you'd expect on a kangaroo, or possibly a tree sloth. There was nothing ape-like about this thing's face. I was staring out at some kind of a feral dog. Maybe a rabid one. It was acting so utterly freaked out, twitching and jerking all over. I was wondering if it was going to explode on my windshield. I sped up, just putting my foot down on the gas and going as fast as I could with the big old overloaded van. This caused the dog monkey to have his face pressed even harder into the glass right in front of me, making it hard to see out the front. I stuck my head out my open side window, and to my surprise, coming down the road toward me from the other direction was an officer of the law in his police vehicle. I waved at him excitedly. I didn't catch his face, but he had to have seen the animal on my windshield, and I prayed that he would make a U-turn and come back around to help me out. Feeling more confident, I slammed on the brakes, which had the unplanned-for effect of causing the cargo in the back to rush forward into the wall to my rear, and the planned-for effect of causing the Dogman to slide back off my hood and onto the highway. He did not land clumsily or with a thud, though. This canine hominid somersaulted and landed on all fours, not missing a single step, in returning to the thick, dark forest, where it immediately became completely impossible to see. I sat there, stunned by all that had just happened, needing to catch my breath before completing my journey. So that's when that cop came back. He was a really old-school guy, I think in his last year before retirement. He walked over to my window, and I asked him if he had seen the Dogman on my windshield when he drove past. He didn't like my beard, and he interrupted my question to let me know that. I began trying to tell him about the Dogman or dog monkey when he interrupted again, asking me to produce ID and registration. I handed it all over while explaining that I was just a driver making a delivery. He got on the radio in his car back to his fellows and made me wait a long time. Eventually, he asked if he could look at what I was delivering. I didn't see why not, and so I let him in the back of the van. Well, I should not have done that. It turns out, I was delivering something I should not have been delivering. My life kind of ended for a while because of this. I lost my girlfriend because she thought that I did know what I was delivering. I lost my part-time office job that she had gotten me for the same reason. My parents disowned me, and my court-appointed lawyer told me I was facing 20 years. Somehow, through some miracle, the guys I was working for all confessed that I knew nothing about their plan, and I got off with 3 years community service. I'm very grateful not to have gone to prison, but my community service still sucked. It's that much time you aren't available to work paying jobs. It's one more reason not to hire you for paying work also. It's one more reason not to answer the phone when you call. Things have finally started getting a little back to normal for me in the last year, even while they became abnormal for everyone else. I ran into a former friend fairly recently, and I was surprised when he asked to buy me coffee and have a conversation. He asked me what I blamed most for the way things went down in my life. My naivete? The kind of people I worked for? I told him no. I said the reason my life took a dive was that I saw Dogman on Friday the 13th. Dogman comes from the afterlife. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I have my own personal theory about the Dogman. It's a theory based on my own individual experiences. It's not something that I got from reading books or watching movies or TV shows or listening to podcasts. So if you disagree with me, that's fine, but please understand that this is my personal reality and my own personal truth. It may not be real to you, but I'm about to describe what's real to me. Dogman comes from the other side. Dogman comes from where we go. I don't know if Dogman is fully alive or if it's a spirit of something which is passed on, but I know it comes from the place where ghosts and spirits come from. Most people think of ghosts as what is left of people who have died. I sometimes feel that makes sense, then other times it seems all wrong. On certain nights, when I experience so-called ghosts in my house, I am certain that I am peering into another dimension or level of existence. I've seen my brother in my home 3 times since his passing, and I'll explain more about that later. This house has been in my family for 3 generations, although we were not the ones who built it. As I understand the history, and this is just my memory of the word-of-mouth retellings I heard my parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles tell, the original builders of this house all died of tuberculosis a long time ago. The eldest daughter went first, and as each family member grew ill after her death, their sickness was blamed on the first who died. How so? Because at that time, in that area, it was believed that she was a vampire, not truly and completely dead. It was believed by those who lived there that she was coming back and feasting on her own family, draining them of their life essence and either killing them or turning them into vampires too. After they had all perished and they had no heirs to leave the house to, it was taken on by the county, who failed time and time again to be able to auction it off. Finally, it was decided to dig up the entire family and drive stakes through all their hearts in public in order to make the property commercially viable again. Even after that, it was years before my ancestors picked up the land and house for a song and fixed it up into what I live in today with my sister and a cousin. I suppose we may be the last of us to live here, as none of us has any children. My sister is not yet 30. I suppose the clock has not fully run out, but it most certainly is ticking faster and faster. I do love this place, we all do, but it has always been haunted. Not just during our lifetimes, but as far back as my family first obtaining the place around the turn of the last century. I don't know if it has anything to do with dead people, but I know it has to do with the granite bedrock and the rushing stream in the back. We have water underground nearby as well. It's the kind of location that naturally allows what we call the paranormal to take place. I don't profess to know what that means, paranormal, but I do know it when I see it, and I've seen a lot of it. When I was growing up, most kids didn't want to sleep over my house because they were all told that we had the ghosts of vampires haunting us. When I was a teenager, all the kids wanted to stay here for the same reason. First of all, I don't think anyone in that family was a vampire. I think they died of tuberculosis and that the others who lived in this area were superstitious. But if they hadn't been, my ancestors would never have been able to pick up this magnificent estate, and I would never have had the luxurious upbringing that I had. So I say fine, be as superstitious as you want, it's never hurt me. That's not to say that I think this stuff is the bunk, because I do not. I've already mentioned that I saw my brother 3 times since he left us. One time, he looked just as he did shortly before he got into that accident. A young teenager. He was sliding down the banister of the staircase, just the way he used to in life. My mother used to yell at him that he was getting too large to do that anymore. She would tell him that the next time he slid down, he would break the banister and break his neck. After he was gone, though, she would sit and look at that staircase and cry. It was a pretty shocking thing to see years after Mom and Dad were both gone too. My 14-year-old brother, sliding down the banister one more time. He vanished as he would have hit the bottom. Is he still sliding down each day? Was that really him? Or sort of a 3D video replay? He didn't appear ghostly to me. I couldn't see through him. He was just there, and then he wasn't anymore. The other 2 times I saw him were entirely different from that, but similar to each other. One time, he was in the kitchen, sitting in a white undershirt and shorts at the kitchen table. I came in from the dining room and reacted with a start because there was a man at the table. In the next instant, I recognized that he was a family member. His features seemed so familiar. My heart clenched, and I got chest pains as I realized that was my brother. Grown up, this is what he might have looked like if he had lived. He seemed sad. He hadn't shaven for days. He was drinking milk from a glass bottle while reading an old-school 20th century-style newspaper. I took a step toward him and he looked up in surprise, but then he was gone. I ran to the table and the newspaper was gone. The milk, they left too. But the table was exactly the same. Explain that one to me. And the third time was not too dissimilar to that one. I saw him again by the stream in the back, fishing like we used to when we were kids. It was another adult version of my brother, this time with graying hair and a longer beard than last time. There was no mistaking him, though. And again, when I approached, he just ceased to be there any longer. You may be beginning to understand why I see the paranormal or supernatural as a situation where multiple worlds overlap. When our time here ends, we go to one of those places and we try it again. It's like failing at a video game and starting the story over from the beginning. Well, I mean, it's not exactly like that, but I think you get what I'm trying to say. These stories are just the tip of the iceberg, though. I've seen things in the night here that make no sense to me. I've seen little men running around wearing clothes. It looked like they stitched them together themselves. Little tiny men like 1 foot or 1.5 feet tall. I've seen creatures that I don't really even know how to describe. I've also seen things that might have been werewolves, or might have been Dogman. How can a location have what appear to be ghosts and what appear to be Dogman? Is this a portal area to another reality? Or is it a location haunted by the spirits of the dead? I tend to lean toward the first answer more, and less toward the second one. I'm not saying that's the perfect solution, and I'm not saying it answers everything neatly, but I do think that it's something along those lines that's going on. Maybe these are different timelines that occasionally overlap. Maybe they're separate and distinct realities. Are there infinite possibilities? Or are the timelines or reality streams dependent on certain things happening first, as in a video game? Even after living in this place over 30 years and hearing all the stories told to me by my family in that time, I can't tell you for sure what's going on here. When I saw the monster, I was with my sister Dee Dee, who's younger than I am. We were sort of walking the perimeter of the backyard after dinner one evening and enjoying the sky changing colors as the sun set. We were walking along near the forest in the back when we heard a sound coming from in there. It sounded like some sort of agitated animal, and the two of us began backing away, watching the dark woods for any movement. We had backed off about 50 feet and were cutting across the lawn back to the house when the creature burst out of the trees and stopped immediately at the edge of the grass, growling loudly and eyeing us as though it hated us. It was a big gorilla of an animal standing mainly on its hind legs, but supporting itself with one long front arm as the other was lifted slightly off the ground. Although the posture reminded me of an alpha male gorilla, the head on the creature appeared canine. I do not mean a long-snouted Bigfoot. I do not mean a pug-faced Dogman. I mean it looked like a wolf mixed with a German shepherd in the face, but with fur like that of a silverback gorilla. Its teeth were like that of a gorilla as well, just huge. As it put on its display to terrify us, we retreated more quickly than before. Although stunned by what was happening, and I know my heart was beating fast already, I don't think either of us were genuinely afraid for our lives yet. After all, we had both grown up in that house. Every time you thought you were seeing something strange there, you just had to wait a few seconds and then it wouldn't be there anymore. I think we were both sort of waiting for the thing to blink out. The dog-headed gorilla man had other ideas, though. It stood up on its hind legs, which were more dog-like than gorilla-like, but just as burly as a gorilla's legs, and it beat its chest like it was King Kong or something. Then, it charged for us in this half-upright and half-quadruped leaping sort of advance, and we screamed. I never ran so hard in my life, and I doubt Dee Dee ever did either. We made it inside and slammed the door behind us, but as I was locking the locks on it, the Dogman caught up. It started banging on that back door. It sounded like it was banging with the sides of its fists, but I never really saw the paws, so I don't know if that's actually what was happening. Maybe it was kicking at the door or hitting it with its shoulder, but in any case, I could see the door bending in when this was happening, and I genuinely wondered if it was gonna hold. And then, it stopped. Just as suddenly as the kid version of my brother disappearing at the bottom of the staircase, the commotion outside our back door ceased too. It sure seems to me that the apparent ghost sightings and the monster sightings have more in common with each other than I would have ever thought before. I can't really explain it better than I have, even though I know I haven't been clear at all. I could tell you more stories of the strange things that happen around here, but none of them would really answer why this is happening. Like I said, it must have something to do with the granite, which contains quartz and the various above and below ground running water all around the property. However, I know that's only a pseudo-scientific explanation at this point. Nobody has ever demonstrated how to retrieve a memory from a stone, so the stone tape theory is just conjecture at this point in our timeline and reality. It's the same for the idea that running water attracts the paranormal or ghosts. We would have to define those terms, paranormal, ghosts, what do they mean? Then once we did that, we'd have to test the theories to see if they have any validity. I've already admitted I can't even define what paranormal or supernatural means, so really all I can share with you are stories. Some of them retold so many times that they're basically fables. I can then give you my theories based on those stories, but my theories are the wild guesses of a blind man as to what an elephant looks like when he's only felt the animal's trunk. We're feeling around in the dark when it comes to these subjects, and I think it's important to remain humble and to remember that. What the heck was that Dogman gorilla thing that chased me and my sister that evening? Where did it go when it disappeared? Was it real in the sense of being conscious? Or was it a projection or hologram? And if we can begin to answer any of these questions, we can start to ask about what we are. Are we any more real than they are? If so, how do we prove that? Well, that's the best case I can make for my argument. You either get what I'm saying or you never will. I know I haven't made the strongest of cases, and I apologize for that, but I still feel absolutely certain that Dogman comes from the afterlife. Don't go anywhere, we've got another story, but first I want to read you my new rhyme. Victoria Tucker, she's the squeezer. She'd even cheer old Ebenezer. New paid sub in excelsis gloria. It's the nice Ms. Tucker named Victoria. Please join me in thanking Victoria Tucker for being today's executive producer and making this episode possible. She just joined our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com at the $1.50 level, which means she gets to see our Sunday night secret uncensored scary stories available nowhere else. If you'd like to be a Scary Stories executive producer like Victoria Tucker, just go to peterbernard.com like she did, or Click the join link below this video and become a channel member. If you join us at the $3 or $7 levels, you also get access to our archives of I forget how many hours of secret uncensored stories. While I'm doing the math on that, you guys sit back and enjoy this weird tale that we got sent into us at our email, scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com. And that story is called I Saw 3 Sasquatch Dancing in the Night. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've got a story to tell you about the scariest night of my life. It doesn't have to do with Dogman. I've never seen one of those. The only cryptid I've ever seen was Bigfoot, but I've seen what seemed to be an entire family of them one night when I was staying at my girlfriend's family's cabin. She and I had lived together for a couple of years, and I guess her parents were finally getting used to me because they offered us the use of their cabin in the woods for our vacation one autumn when we were in our mid-20s. They kept it for themselves all summer, but it was a warm week in October and the leaves were all sorts of colors, so we weren't complaining. Neither of us had been outside the city for years, so the entire thing was awesome. The air smelled so different out in the country, especially once we got under the cover of the trees. It was like we had been asleep for years and we were finally waking up. To get to that cabin, you had to park the car in her parents' secret place, then hike for about 10 minutes through the woods on a barely discernible path. It felt like you were a million miles from civilization, but it's really only 15 or 20 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, I guess. That part of Pennsylvania has a lot of little hidey holes all around. You'd be surprised. So, we were surrounded for miles by forest, and we felt that we were as alone as we could possibly be. That put us in a romantic mood, and we began to get affectionate with each other under a tree near the cabin. Suddenly, we were being plunked on the head by acorns, by some squirrel somewhere, I guess. At least we assumed it was a squirrel, but we couldn't see it anywhere overhead. After the third time I'd been plunked right on top of my head, I talked my girlfriend into going back inside. That night, things started hitting the roof and walls of the cabin. I don't know what they were, but they were larger than acorns. I suppose we were being pelted by rocks, but I could only hear it, not see it. My girlfriend was no longer feeling affectionate, as the noise of the projectiles bouncing off the cabin was making her paranoid. She was convinced we were being watched, and she was making me feel that way too. She asked me to go outside and make whoever it was go away. I understood that she was afraid, but why did she think I wasn't? Also, what was I supposed to do if it turned out to be a gang of creepy deliverance type guys? If it was 3 or 4 men, I was going to be overmatched. We didn't have cell service out there in those days, and I had no way to call the cops or anyone else for that matter. I said we should ignore them and get back to what we were doing, but even after I locked the windows and drew the shades, we both still felt like we were being watched. Finally, I gave in to my girlfriend's request, and I went outside to see what I could see, which, at first, was nothing. I did notice that I no longer could hear the crickets that I had heard earlier in the evening. It was very strangely quiet out there in that night. I tried to speak, but discovered that nerves had throttled my voice. Clearing my throat, I called out to whomever might be out there, asking them to cut us some slack and leave us alone. It was then that I saw them. There were at least 3, and they were dancing back and forth in the moonlight near the edge of the wood line. They would sway back and forth, watching me, then dart super fast behind a tree. I would see another doing the same at a different spot, then it would also cut behind a tree. It was almost like watching 3-card Monty being played out by 7-foot-tall ape-like human beings. Because, to me, these were men. They were human. I mean, they were savage and entirely covered in hair or fur like a bear, but they had human-like mouths and noses. They may have had ape-like brow ridges and hairlines, and their eyes did not look like ours either, but their hands, their legs and feet, they were more human than chimp or gorilla. They were also much larger than I was, and I'm 6'4". I'm not a short guy, but I wouldn't mess with any of those guys even individually. Like I said, there were at least 3 of them there that night, and they were all in time with each other as though they were hearing a music I couldn't hear that they were keeping in time with. I felt like they had done this many times. They were well rehearsed and they functioned as a unit like one mind separated among the lot of them. They presented a united and intimidating front. And I just shut up and walked back inside. After locking the doors securely, I turned around to tell my girlfriend what I saw, but I found all I could do was weep. I just cried. I guess as some sort of fear or shock reaction. The rock pelting stopped, and the rest of the night was normal outside. Our mood had been broken though, and we just sort of huddled there through the night, getting little bits of sleep, but mainly impatiently waiting for the sun to come back. I was in a bit of a rush to get out of there. We had the place to ourselves for another 6 days, but neither of us wanted to stay. On the way home, we argued viciously. She didn't believe anything I said about seeing the 3 or 4 Bigfoot out there. She said I was just a little scared wimp, too weak to protect her. It was the beginning of the end of our relationship, even though we didn't technically officially break up for another 6 or 7 months. She just wasn't into me anymore. She thought I'd been pushed around by some locals and then cried about it. She really never accepted that I was being honest. If she had seen an entire family of creatures much taller than I was or am, darting back and forth at superhuman speeds as I had seen, she might have been more forgiving. But she didn't. And she wasn't. And the only good part of that story for me is that at least I never married her. If I had, then I would have had to hire a lawyer and pay her money indefinitely just because she didn't like me anymore. I don't really understand why any guy would ever get married. I find marriage more frightening than an entire family of Bigfoot. No offense to those of you who are happily married, all 4 or 5 of you out there. I guess you must have figured out how to dominate a family of Bigfoot so that your spouse continues to desire you. As for me, I've remained single ever since. I saw 3 Sasquatch dancing in the night. My turkey scared off a dogman. Dear Scary Stories NYC. Way back in the 1970s, my family and I saw a dogman. We called it a werewolf, and we kept it secret to ourselves so that the entire neighborhood didn't think we were crazy. Nobody knew that there were real-life wolf-headed men back in those days, but we knew that there were because one showed up in our backyard trying to figure out how to abduct our Thanksgiving Day meal. There was a year when I was a kid that my father won a turkey in a Halloween raffle. We all thought it was going to be a frozen one, but when the guy came by to deliver the prize, it was an actual living turkey in a cage far too small for it. My father went to the pet store and got something to clamp onto its leg, then tied the thing up so that it had the run of the yard. A friend of his told him what to feed it and how to fatten it up, and the plan was to butcher the poor guy for our Thanksgiving dinner that year. My mom had grown up on a farm and she knew how to do that kind of stuff. Dad was a city boy. He ran and hid when Mom did the slicing and the dicing. He would go fishing, but then she would have to gut the fish for him so that he didn't faint. Anyway, this was back in the 1970s, but even that long ago, it was a weird thing to have a turkey tied up in your yard in the suburbs in Pennsylvania. Granted, we were on the very edge of the suburbs, bordering up on a large natural area in back of us, but our house was technically at the end of a street in suburbia. We were over south of Pittsburgh in a town that I still have family in, so I'd rather not mention it by name. We lived in an area where sightings of thunderbirds and Bigfoot are still, to this very day, fairly common, but we never saw those things. I did have a friend at school whose whole family had watched a flashing UFO over their backyard for over an hour. I talked to his sister about it. She told the same story he did, so I know it was a real event. But the paranormal event that happened to my family was our sighting of the Dogman, and it was all centered around that turkey. Of course, being a kid, I had named the turkey, and of course, not being very original, I named him Tom. I had developed a liking for Tom, even though I doubt he could differentiate me from the other humans. I projected all sorts of wonderful Disney-like qualities on that ugly scavenger, and I grew increasingly sad about the idea of him giving up his entire life just to feed me and my family one single time. It seemed so unfair, even if we used him for sandwiches and leftovers too. I didn't want him to give up his one and only life just because he would be so delicious with a little salt and pepper. I began to try to broach the subject with my parents, asking them if we could maybe keep Tom as a pet and get some other turkey to have for dinner. I was laughed at. Eyes rolled in heads when I approached. I was informed of what it cost to keep Tom fed, and it was more than my allowance was, so I was unable to create a strategy I could afford, which would keep the bird alive. It became increasingly clear to me that my friendship with Tom would soon be leaving my heart and entering my belly. And then, a Thanksgiving miracle happened. I awoke on Thanksgiving morning to a horrible racket. It sounded like it was coming from out back where Tom was tied up. Frightened that he might be under attack from a dog or a cat, I raced out back. My father and mother were already there, staring in stunned surprise at the scene playing out in front of them. Old Tom Turkey was making this sound something like a growling. It was in the middle of a standoff with a creature that had to be 6 or 7 times its size. A creature that was probably 3 times my size. There was a dog-headed bear kind of thing, standing there, on its 2 back legs. Those legs looked more like dog than bear legs, as they stood up way taller in the air, and I could see daylight through them. The skin hung tight to its muscular frame, not loose, the way a bear's skin hangs. It was leaning over, reaching out a giant hand that ended in these long, sharp-looking fingernails or claws. It looked like it wanted to grab that old turkey by its throat and run off with him, but each time he was about to grab, Tom would either move out of the way or snap at the Dogman with his beak. It was clear that the little bird was scared, but it had the giant Dogman just as freaked out, like those cartoons about elephants being scared of mice. Finally, Tom burst out with an absolute freak-out of squawking and honking type scary sounds, charging at the huge Dogman and flapping his wings insanely. The Dogman leaped up like he'd never seen such a thing in his life, and, wide-eyed, he ran off into the forest. I'm betting that was the first turkey that Dogman had ever seen in real life. It looked like he thought that bird was going to eat him, instead of the other way around. I ran down to see if Tom was all right, but he tried to snap at me too. He was still too upset to get anywhere near. That was one serious ninja turkey that we had living with us that year. Well, of course, I argued that we had to keep that bird as a pet now. I mean, it had scared a werewolf off. I was told, first of all, that was a bear, and second of all, that my father had scared it off, not the turkey. I was completely overruled, and we ate Old Tom for dinner that Thanksgiving. I thought about abstaining from the meal out of respect to my late avian friend, but he was cooked so well, it smelled too good to resist. I said a prayer for the brave old turkey, and then dug in. But I might not have survived to tell this tale if it hadn't happened that my turkey scared off a dogman. And now for the story we'd like to dedicate to Kathy Barrickman. My werewolf brother stole my fiancée. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I brought my fiancée home to meet my parents last Thanksgiving, and my prodigal werewolf half-brother decided to pop in uninvited and leave with my girlfriend, figuratively speaking. The reason I think you might find this interesting is that my brother was and is a werewolf. People think that I'm being mean when I refer to my mother's other son as a werewolf, but I mean it literally. Even when we were boys, his nickname was Lone Wolf. I don't know what a werewolf is exactly, but I know that by my 17th birthday, I already knew he was one. Also, again, I'm speaking literally, even if it doesn't sound like I'm doing so. I watched him transform into the thing that he becomes every summer night for 2 years before he finally moved out. He didn't change under the full moon. He changed in the warm months. I don't know how it worked, and he never explained to me what he was going through, but somehow when the weather was warmer, he would become a kind of a bipedal wolf. He and I shared a bedroom. I would always pretend I was sleeping but watch him through barely open eyes. He would either roll around in bed uncomfortably until the transformation would reverse itself, or else he would go out, presumably to hunt. When he left, he looked fully and completely like an animal. He did not go out in his pajamas, in other words. He would move toward the staircase leading up from our basement bedroom so silently that I would never know if he had actually gone up them or not. He would return just as silently, startling me if I happened to be awake at the time. He either never noticed this or humored me, allowing me to fake sleeping while he resumed doing the same. We never spoke one single word to each other about any of this, which was fine with me. I do not know how or why he would change into the animal. I suspect it came from his father's side of the family, since I had no other relative with this affliction. None of us knew about his paternal family at all, but the rumors about them were not good. I secretly wished he would go away. He and I never argued or fought because he was so much bigger than I was, and tougher. That didn't mean I liked him, though. When he lived in the same room as me, I wished he would go away. Then, when he went away, I wished he would never come back. I had almost never had conflict with him, and yet I disliked him far more than people I'd gotten into fistfights with. I can't explain it better than that. Christopher, not his real name, would complain that our mother favored me, which I thought was a cheap shot. I was competing hard for her attention, and this guy's counter move was to be deliberately annoying to both her and me, getting negative attention from both of us, then trying to make us feel guilty about it. He never once did anything thoughtful or nice for her to get attention that way. I spent 10% of my allowance getting little candies for my mom. Christopher spent all his allowance on himself, then complained when our mother didn't share my candy gifts with him. We had a basic difference of philosophy about the world, and even years after he had disappeared from all of our lives, I continued to loathe him just as I had when we were still sleeping in the same bedroom. I didn't dislike him because he was a werewolf, but I felt the werewolf transformations were nature agreeing with me that Christopher was something of a monster. So fast forward to 2019. I had asked my girlfriend of over a year to get married, and we had set a date for spring 2020. I was looking forward to going home for Thanksgiving and introducing the love of my life to my parents. Let's call her Victoria, which is not her real name. When we arrived at the house I had grown up in, we were greeted not only by my parents, but by a now fully grown version of my werewolf brother Christopher as well. He was looking like a human, of course. It was winter after all. I was immediately put on edge and annoyed by his unannounced presence. I was bothered that my parents hadn't warned me, but it turned out they only found out about 20 minutes before I did. He had just shown up, right before Victoria and I had, and he hadn't called or written ahead of time. This version of my brother looked unlike anyone I'd ever seen. He was like Grizzly Adams, but his beard was longer and his hair dark. You know what? That guy who runs Twitter? When he has the long hair and the beard, my brother kind of resembled him, but really buff, as in muscular. He never worked out when I knew him, but Victoria seemed to notice right away that he had been using weights of late. She made a point of asking him about every detail of his workout regimen, and I felt like I didn't belong there in my own home. I'm glad that she was friendly toward my family, but it was as though my werewolf brother had mesmerized my intended and was about to ruin my plans and my future. After sitting through the most annoying Thanksgiving dinner of all time, watching my fiancée flirting with a monster, I pulled her aside into the pantry and tried to warn her about what she was getting into. I told her that my half-brother was a werewolf, and she laughed. I insisted it was true, and she became annoyed at me. As we were beginning to get into a quiet whispering argument by the dry goods, the werewolf inserted himself into our conversation. He told Victoria that I was speaking the truth. This was actually the first time he and I had ever discussed this subject. He told Victoria that he was actually a werewolf. Of course, she thought he was only flirting with her. In fact, he was partially flirting. Christopher challenged her to go outside with him and watch him become a werewolf. She laughed and immediately accepted the challenge. I walked outside with them, quizzing my brother on when he had learned to change in the winter. He looked at me funny for a few seconds while parsing my question. I had forgotten that I could only change in the summer, he told me, adding, "Now I can change whenever I need to." That was the longest explanation of the phenomenon he ever gave me, either before or after that date. All I know is based on what I saw with my own eyes, and that sliver of information he dropped that Thanksgiving night 1 year ago. We walked, the three of us, in silence, deeper and deeper into the woods behind our home. I pointed out that we were about to run out of forest soon, when Christopher seemed to settle on a given spot to perform his little magic trick. I watched as he walked in circles, unable to seem to settle down. Victoria giggled, and I hoped that whatever happened, she and I would get out of it safely, and that we would be leaving together to go back home. Onward and onward. Christopher circled himself until he began to become truly uninteresting, nearly hypnotizing us with his repetitive, meaningless motions. And then suddenly, Victoria screamed. It was one of those screams like from an old horror movie. This was no half-hearted shout. This was a full-on scream, and she was reacting logically to what she was seeing. My brother jerked up from 6 feet tall to 7, all in one ferocious movement, tearing his clothes to shreds in one loud stretch. It was 2 more sudden, horrible-sounding and sickening-looking palpitations later when we were looking up at what my brother had become. Some of his clothing lay tattered around him, while some of it was literally pulverized to dust by the suddenness of the change, and it wafted back down to earth as we both screamed and backed away from the heaving, hyperventilating, dog-headed, man-like beast. He stood between 8 and 9 feet tall, and he appeared to have absolutely nothing human left in those canine eyes. The dog beast that had been born from the same mother as I was looked down at me and huffed. I backed away, not certain that he wasn't about to chew me in half with one single bite. Then he turned his gaze to my girlfriend, the woman I was supposed to marry, and I saw an even more frightening look in his eyes. It was met by the look in Victoria's eyes, which was far hungrier than I had ever seen. How could she give him a look more smoldering than any she had given her own fiancé? I was about to ask her that very question until I realized how whiny it would have sounded. He had turned the tables on me. Christopher used to try to get attention by complaining when he didn't. I had been the charismatic one, and he had been the whiner. Now here he was, stealing my intended wife from me just by standing there, and my only response was to think about throwing a tantrum and demanding people treat me better. The world doesn't work that way. It didn't work that way for Christopher when we were kids, and it didn't work that way for me when my Victoria fell out of love with me and into love with my werewolf brother. If this were a fantasy or a romance novel, I suppose the Dogman homewrecker would have swept her off her feet and gone off with her to walk into the sunset or whatever. In fact, she came home with me that night, but nothing was ever the same between us. She acted sneaky all the time from then on, and she left me without even leaving a note or a text message or an email, only 3.5 weeks after that. I know she's okay, because I've been in touch with her sister, who's been giving me whatever updates Victoria gives her permission to give me. I don't know if she is in fact with my brother, but I can only assume. I know she's with some man, because I've been informed a while back that she's now the mother of a baby boy. I can only imagine what her life must be like right now. My therapist tells me I should stop from thinking about them, so that's what I usually try to do. But since it's coming up on the first anniversary of that horrible Thanksgiving, and since I'm trapped out here with my parents again, it's hard not to think back on what happened just last year. Because that was the year when my werewolf brother stole my fiancée. I saw Dogman walk through the wall. Dear Scary Stories NYC, I've had a casual interest in cryptids for years. I always wondered how such creatures could be seen as often as they are, without leaving behind enough evidence for science to call them real yet. I wondered if they lived underground, in places that we hadn't discovered yet. In all honesty, I also wondered if they were just figments of people's imaginations. And then I moved to Pennsylvania, and that's where I saw a Dogman walk through a wall. Pennsylvania is a haunted state. I suppose every place on the globe has something spooky about it, but Pennsylvania? They got more than their share of weird when the world was first being created. There is a mountain ridge over there where people see UFOs, ghosts, giant birds, Bigfoot, and yes, even werewolves or dogmen. It's the freakiest place I have ever been to, and yet while I lived there, most of my neighbors told me they had never experienced anything strange at all. Don't get me wrong, I had some folks on my block who had claimed to see monsters and UFOs and ghosts, but for the most part, people just look at you funny if you ask them about anything weird being seen in that area. I was experiencing stuff all the time though, so I began to seek out people who I could talk to about what I was going through. Seeing a monster once can be a terrifying and traumatic experience. Move to a place where they're all around, all the time, and it becomes a traumatic lifestyle, unending and round the clock. Strange things can happen in broad daylight. There can be a man in your kitchen that isn't there anymore a second later. Go for a walk in the woods and see that same strange man again, peeking out at you from behind a rock or a tree. Try to feel comfortable when things like that are going on. Some people could write you an entire story about any one of the strange experiences I survived during my time living in PA over near West Virginia. I could too, actually. I'm going to try and focus in on the Dogman incidents, but you should understand that while I was there, Dogman was only part of the entire mix of ingredients that combined to scare me back to New Jersey. Granted, New Jersey sure has its own share of weird, but it doesn't happen to me here. The block I live on now is the most ordinary block in all of New Jersey. I heard they used to shoot Nickelodeon's Pete and Pete here back in the 1990s, and that they chose it because it looked like any other street in America. That's fine by me. I've had enough of monsters and ghosts for one lifetime. Before I continue, and I've got a lot more to say, I want it clear that I'm not dissing Pennsylvania. Like I said, most of my neighbors there never had any strange experiences at all. I mean, at all. It's beautiful country. It's nice people. And if you move there, chances are you're not going to have to cope with things that I had to cope with. I'm not telling people to be scared of PA or even that ridgeline that runs through towns like Hopwood and Fairchance. It's that ridge that's haunted, though. It's some kind of magical central vortex or a disturbance in Obi-Wan's force or something like that. Whatever is going on there, I know it has to do with that ridge line. Maybe there's something in those mountains that was meant to stay buried deep under the ground. Maybe something got pushed up to the surface when those mountains formed. I don't know. Maybe it's even an entrance into an underground world, like those stories from over 100 years ago. Maybe the UFOs and Dogmen and Thunderbirds all come from the inner earth out to us through that ridgeline of mountains and hills. There's something there, at least some kind of energy, if not something physical. The place is different. It's very much its own unique location, and nothing else but that. While I lived there, I wanted to visit Laurel Caverns, located on the eastern side of the ridge. I never got to, but I have read about it and looked at photos. I wonder how many other caves and tunnels exist through that area that we don't officially know about. It seems to me that it would not be impossible that there might be spaces and tunnels in those hills, the equivalent of the space we humans occupy in the area on the surface. In other words, it seems to me that there could be as many things living under the ground in that area as there are above ground. Bigfoot and creatures like that, if they're real, might be able to live very close to human habitations, yet not be captured or shot, because they have access to hiding spaces as vast as our towns and settlements above ground. It sounds all neat and logical when I put it that way. The problem is that some of my sightings did not fit in with what could be described as sightings of animals or even other intelligent entities like us. The commonality between all animals that I'm aware of is that we exist physically in space and time. Some of us breathe air, others derive oxygen from water using gills, but we're all physical beings. We can't do things like walk through walls for this reason. I'm going to tell you now why my own theory does not suffice to explain Pennsylvania away. I have seen Dogman do things that no physical being could do. I have seen Dogman disappear into thin air, and I have seen Dogman walk directly through a wall in my own former home. Talk about a motivation to sell and move. This was the final straw that broke this human's back. I had been awakened at night by scratching sounds, and it was driving me bonkers. I had exterminators and animal people scour the building, looking for raccoons stuck in the wall and anything else that we could think of. No evidence of termites or other insects was found, and yet I had the place fumigated anyway. I followed all the advice I was given, and yet, when all was said and done, I was still awakened each and every night, with literally no exception, by tapping and scratching noises. One night, I could hear something breathing in my room, but I couldn't see anything or anyone there. My first impression is that there was a large, heavy-set man there, because the breathing was so loud and heavy. But as it persisted, I thought it reminded me more of my old Irish setter that I had when I was a kid. She would breathe loudly in her later years, and she would snore even louder. I never found out what that sound was, but to me personally, I think that was my first Dogman sighting, or I guess hearing, since I didn't see anything. It might have been anything, I suppose, but I personally file it away in my Dogman drawer. I had almost begun to accept hearing the breathing at night, as it happened every night. I even tried to record it, but nothing came out on the recorder. Granted, I was using a very old cassette recorder from my youth and not some fancy new EVP recorder, but I got room noise hiss on the tape and nothing more. That made me wonder if I was going crazy and imagining things, but if I was crazy, wouldn't I also hear the same imaginary sounds on the tape? Didn't me not hearing it on that tape prove that I was actually sane? I wasn't sure, and I didn't like that I was beginning to doubt my own sanity. After all, nothing like that had ever plagued me before. I'd always been kinda normal, I think. At least people always treated me like I was normal. When I moved to that ridgeline, though, when I moved to PA, then all of a sudden, I began to feel insane. I was about to go for a walk in the woods one day when I saw a Dogman, plain and simple. It was not an upright walking canid. It was a hairy man with a dog head. I don't know if it was actually a dog in any way at all. I think it was parallel evolution, maybe. A human-like creature that evolved to have a dog head, not a dog that evolved to walk upright. I could clearly see him from about where the belly button would be if he had one, up to his tall, almost rabbit-like ears. It was just as dawn was beginning to break, and he stood there perfectly still in the early morning light. It was the eye shine that first made me notice it, shining bright white, almost yellow against the dark woods behind the creature or man or whatever it was. I gasped as I thought he was looking at me. However, I soon realized he was staring at the cat sleeping on my neighbor's back porch. I really liked that cat, and I shared house keys with that neighbor, so I went over and I let the cat inside. Later in the day, I told my neighbor about my sighting, and he took me seriously. He never called me crazy, and he didn't quiz me about the details. He and his wife just kept that cat indoors from then on, a decision which I applaud. The woods in PA are not a safe place for a house cat. There was another time when a friend of mine from years ago came to stay over my place for a weekend. She kept telling me that she saw a guy in a monster costume outside the window, and I kept trying to locate what she was describing. I had no doubt she was seeing something, because there was always something weird going on over there. That night, I got up to use the bathroom, and on my way back to bed, I saw a large, dark, hairy form outside the window, staring in at her sleeping in the bed. I screamed in surprise and horror, which woke her up. and caused the silhouette to run off. It didn't disappear, it went away, and I never got a clear look at it. It very well could have been the Dogman again, or it might have been something else, such as a Sasquatch or a very tall man. You would think that it should be easy to tell them apart, due to the Dogman having ears on top, but I was half asleep, and I only noticed the dark shadow of the creature. Its eyes would have been above the top of the window from my point of view, so I did not see the head. I do suppose it might have been a waking dream, since I had monsters on the brain and so did she. On the other hand, I'm inclined to think it was a genuine sighting because of how she'd been complaining all evening that there was something outside that had seemed interested in her. Needless to say, that was the last time that old friend ever came to stay over with me. It was in that same bedroom, although probably 2.5 months later, when I had the main sighting that I'm writing to you about. I awoke at 3:13 a.m. I remember that's what it said on my clock radio, and I heard someone in my second-floor hallway outside the bedroom. I should have been alone in the house, so I called out in a deep voice that I had a gun, and I was willing to use it. I didn't actually, but I did have a baseball bat next to the bed, so I grabbed that. The noise in the hallway stopped for a moment, and I shouted out again, in the scariest voice I could make, that I could hear him, and I'd already called the cops. Of course I had not, but I was looking around the room for my phone, so that I could. That was when the most incredible thing that I have ever experienced. A 7 or 8 foot tall, fur-covered bodybuilder with some kind of prehistoric wolf head walked into the room through the wall itself. It didn't look unnatural at all when it happened. The way it moved through solid objects, it looked like an everyday occurrence. That didn't stop me from screaming like a little child and curling up into a ball in the corner of my bed furthest from the manifestation. I want to say there was nothing science fiction about it. There was no odd glowing at the edges. There was no distortion. The wall and objects he passed through did not have ectoplasm on them later. It was just as though the wall had been made of air, and the Dogman walked through that air. All of the odd experiences and sightings I had to deal with while I was there were confusing and annoying. This one was terrifying. I thought that thing had come into my bedroom to end my life, and this was not the way that I wanted to go. I screamed like a scream queen from the movies, and I'm a 6-foot-tall guy, okay? My heart still beats too hard when I even think about that night. I really almost died of fright. I almost killed myself with my own fear. Fortunately for me, the Dogman was not actually there to kill me. He walked across my room as though he didn't see or hear me, and he walked out of the other wall of the room as well. I want to remind you, I was sleeping on the second floor, and there was nothing outside that wall he walked through except my backyard, which must have been a 30 or 40-foot drop from there. When the Wolfman thing was through that outside wall, I leaped out of bed and ran over to the windows, looking down, up, straight, right, left, every direction, and I could not see where the Dogman had gone to. It was an awful lot like a residual haunting, except that it couldn't have been a recreation of a past event. Before that house was built, there was nothing there at all. How could the Dogman have been a ghost recreating a past walk when there was never a surface there to walk on before the house was built, and there was never anything at all on that level past the outside wall of the house? The entire experience unnerves me to my core, even now, because it just doesn't even make the slightest bit of sense. I realized that I was starting to stop accepting scientific explanations, and I was starting to research and believe in things like demonology. That's just not where I want my head to be at. So I got my act together, and I moved out of there. Maybe I'm burying my head in the sand, but I'm not a demon slayer. I'm just an accountant. When I look at numbers, I don't want to think of numerology and mysticism. I want to see dollars and cents, period. I need to remain rooted in ordinary day-to-day reality, or I will not be able to do my job. And then, if I cannot do my job, I cannot afford to live, so it's not really an option. For these reasons, I can't personally live in Pennsylvania, at least not along that ridgeline, not while working a full-time job. I just cannot. I do admit, life has become humdrum and boring since I moved to a humdrum and boring place to live, but on the other hand, I'm a humdrum and boring kind of guy. I no longer think cryptids live underground. I think they're from a parallel reality or something like that. I think they coexist with us, but at the same time, they don't coexist with us at all. They're there, but at the same time, they're some completely different place too. I don't know if that makes sense, but if you ask me, Dogman doesn't exactly make sense. And my whole life felt crazy once I was able to truthfully say, I saw Dogman walk through the wall. He's our Saint Nick, a real Christmas carol. He's more fun than a monkey full of barrels. I'm speaking, of course, about today's executive producer, Nicholas Carroll. We call him Saint Nick because he helped make this episode possible. In return, we send him links to watch our secret uncensored Bigfoot stories that we put out on Sunday nights. You can check them out too by either joining our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com or else by doing what old Saint Nicholas Carroll did and clicking the join link under this video. And now, here's PQ Ribber with more information.
Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it. You can become a channel member by clicking the join link below. Then you can check our community page to find the links to 10 hours or more of secret, uncensored Dogman stories too wild to be told on this channel. Your other option is to join our paid subscribers club at peterbernard.com. That's Peter's homemade club, where he will personally email you the links as well as occasional secret club messages. You may also be included as an executive producer in a future episode. You have a scary experience you want to tell us about? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or else call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LESS-SCARY. The machine cuts off every few minutes, so if you have a long story, please keep calling back and we'll piece it together later on. Good night and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.